Hello and welcome back to Curious Economics. Okay, so how's everyone doing today? Hope you guys are having a great weekend. And as you can see, our topic today would be Monopoly. So let me just change the music really quickly. Much more peaceful. There. Okay, so Monopoly today. I'm pretty sure most of you would have heard of Monopoly before. So basically, as you know, it's one company in an entire industry. And yeah, essentially there's just only one seller in the market. So there isn't any choice for you or any alternative for you to purchase from any other company within that particular market. So let's get started. Again, all of these is kind of for me, so to make sure that I cover parts that are relevant to you and the syllabus as well for A-level and IB. So we'll be covering the different assumptions and characteristics in Monopoly, the diagrams and the analysis, the evaluation, natural monopoly, and also what the government can do about monopolies and why they are good and why they're bad, of course. So kind of like the disadvantages and the advantages and how the government can try to get the best out of them. So before we kind of move into the topic of monopolies, let's try to have a think about which of these three examples actually come under monopoly. So we've got the only fried chicken shop in your town. So it might or might not be a KFC. It might be like Chicken Cottage, or it might be a kebab shop selling fried chicken. So there's that. Or it might be Google Web Search, or London Underground. So which of the following would you think are monopolies? Or which of the following aren't monopolies? And how do you actually define whether something is a monopoly? Okay, so I'll just give you like 10 seconds or so you can have a think about whether the below would be categorized as a monopoly or not. Okay, you have like 5 seconds left. Okay, cool. So, as always in economics, it depends, yeah? So whether something is a monopoly depends on not only the definition of monopoly and how you define the definition of monopoly. So you'll see what I mean here. So, if we look at a monopoly at a pure economics standpoint, then a pure monopoly would be one that is a market where there's only one seller. Yeah, so that would be a pure monopoly. But if a firm has more than, say, 25% of a market or 50% of market share in the US, then that would be called a legal monopoly. So the difference between a legal monopoly and a pure monopoly is that for a legal monopoly, it depends on which country you're in and what the law states in that particular country. And if that particular industry or company is a legal monopoly, then that state would be able to enact laws and regulations or perhaps penalize them or take action. Yeah. So that's kind of the difference between a legal monopoly and a pure monopoly. So pure monopoly is more about, say, in economics, when we look at the theory and define that if there's only one seller, then it would be a pure monopoly. Okay, that's good. And if we go back to the previous examples, the reason it's so hard to define whether something is a monopoly is because, say, for KFC, say the only fried chicken shop in your town, it's hard to know if it is a monopoly or not because it depends on how we define the market, right? So if the market only includes the vicinity or the area of your own town, then yes, KFC would be a monopoly. But if the market actually includes the whole of the UK or includes the whole of London, then certainly there are other chicken shops out there. So in that sense, it is not a monopoly. So in a way, it kind of depends on your geographic area and how big you define the area to be, right? So similarly for, say, Google web search, it can or cannot be a monopoly as well. So you can argue that for Google web search, there are alternatives out there. For example, a close alternative might be, say, Bing or DuckDuckGo, although not a lot of users would actually use those search engines. So in essence, it might not be a pure monopoly in economics, but it is perhaps certainly a legal monopoly within a few countries, and particularly for web search. And of course, in this case, we need to assess like the business lines of Google as well, because Google doesn't only carry out web search services, but you also consume other Google services like the Android operating system, right? So in that sense, it's not necessarily a monopoly as well, because there are other competitors for their other product lines. But in general, if we look at web search in particular, it would be, say, like a legal monopoly, because it's got like 90% of all the searches on the internet. So that's a very significant amount. And then finally, London Underground. I would say this would be some of the closest examples to a pure monopoly within London, because there aren't any close substitutes. So you can take the bus in London, but it doesn't really get you to the same place at the same amount of time. So it depends on traffic, and of course there are delays and all of that stuff. And also the price might be different. So the substitutes are significantly different to justify that the London Underground is a pure monopoly, and that there's only one London Underground that's operating, and it's operated by the Transport for London Authority. So in a sense, I would say London Underground would be a monopoly. Yeah. Okay, cool. So yeah, as you can see, depending on how you define the terms, and this is the reason why definitions are so important in economics, we can have different conclusions about different concepts. So in this case, we've got this comic about how it's a brilliant economics department, and all the economists are like pointing different ways and have different opinions. So let's just talk about some of the characteristics of a monopoly. So in an industry where there's only one firm or one company operating, most likely there will be high barriers to entry into the market. So this means that it's not easy for new firms or new companies to enter into the monopoly market. So for example, the reason why it's so difficult to, say, break into the market for web search or for search engines is because that you need to build your own algorithm, right? So that's a lot of upfront costs, and also you need to have search data about how the users behave online and things like that, so that you would be able to accurately rank what the users are looking for. So actually a lot of Google searches are based on our behavior online, and say how many people actually clicked on that link last year after seeing that particular search result. So in that case, actually, that would not be easily available to the public or other companies seeking to enter into the market. So high barriers to entry would be a characteristic of a monopoly, which we will discuss further. There shouldn't be any close substitutes, because of course if there are close substitutes, you can just use the substitute instead of consuming from that one and only company. And then knowledge would not be perfect, and other firms would not be able to replicate the same production or the production of the same good. And of course, if there's only one company in the market, then they'll be able to set the market price, since they're the only company that's selling the product, right? So they can charge kind of like however much they want, depending on where they maximize profits. So we will talk a bit more about big tech later, but recently there have been like a congressional hearing on tech firms. So in that case, quite a few CEOs from Amazon, Google, and all of that actually went into Congress, and they were kind of questioned by the US Congress. So I found that quite interesting, and it'll be interesting to look up as well if you're interested. So let's just talk a bit about the different barriers to entry within a monopoly. So in general, a monopoly tend to experience high economies of scale. So what economies of scale is when you produce a lot of the same good or service, then you would tend to see that your average costs are going down. So your cost of producing each unit of the product would tend to go down when you produce a lot of it. And the reason for that is because, say, if you are able to purchase the raw materials in large amounts, and then you'll be given, like, say, bulk discounts in the purchases that you make, and eventually you would experience economies of scale. So for example, if you are a bread maker, again, you might be able to buy a lot of flour in bulk when you produce like thousands of pieces of bread a day. And as a result, you'll be able to ask for a discount for the flour that you buy, which eventually would make your cost lower and very possibly make your bread cheaper than your competitors, since you're so big and you're enjoying bulk discounts from your suppliers. And as a result, you would be more competitive in your market. Yeah. So that's economies of scale, and so it's very difficult for new companies to enter into the market and provide the good at a similar price point compared to you, because they might not enjoy economies of scale, or they might not be big enough to enjoy those discounts when they first enter into the market. And secondly, we've got brand loyalty. So I'm sure a lot of you have got Apple smartphones, and especially since they have like an entire ecosystem that's built upon the iOS franchise. It's not a franchise, but like the iOS software, we might find it very difficult to change our phones from Apple to Android, for example. And that's because all of your data and your contacts are synced with the Apple database or your Apple ID. So if that's the case, very strong brand loyalty will prevent new companies from, creating their own operating system to lure Apple users to use their operating system instead. So that's brand loyalty. And then we've got legal and technical barriers. Of course, it's very difficult, again, to create an operating system, or it's very difficult in terms of, say, computer chips to create processors, right? And there will be patents and copyrights for these design processes, so it's very difficult for new entrants to enter into the industry. So some other barriers to entry might include, say, the control of resources. I'm not sure if you've heard of De Beers. They sell diamonds, and since they used to own most of the diamond mines in the world, like 95% or something, they essentially have a monopoly because they control all the goods in that particular market, right? So there are some natural monopolies as well, which we will discuss about this concept a bit later, which is basically for some industries, it is just naturally efficient to have only one company. And if there are two companies in that industry, then the cost might be too high and both companies might not be able to make a profit. And then finally, there's anti-competitive behavior. Yeah. So for anti-competitive behavior, it's when the dominant monopoly within the industry might say, I don't actually want other entrants to come in, or I don't want new companies to come in and compete with me. So therefore, I'm going to price my products extremely cheaply so that when new entrants come into the market, they might, say, make a loss. So that would be, say, limit pricing or even predatory pricing. So now let's talk a little bit about why big tech is so powerful. The reason that monopolists like Google are threatening the economy, like they're saying here from Harvard Business Review, is because a lot of the data that they gather from us can be privatized. So because they know how we behave online and our purchase preferences online, since they know what we buy and they know how much we buy them for and for what prices, they would be able to essentially understand where the opportunities are, or business opportunities to sell goods and services are, and as a result they would be able to create new barriers to entry. Since new firms that hope to take advantage of these opportunities won't have that data, and they won't have that competitive edge anymore. And therefore it would prevent new competitors from entering into, say, new industries like e-commerce, for example. I guess it's not really a new industry anymore, but I think you understand my point, where it's very difficult for competitors to enter into even an existing industry when you've got all the information within the industry and you know all the technicalities of it in order to maximize your profits, or you know all the profit margins within that industry. And of course you won't share that data, because by sharing it, it will make you less competitive. So in that sense, it's kind of like a hoarding of knowledge and expertise to an extent. And similarly here with this Yahoo article, dangerous for democracy, big tech hearing gives clues on future of antitrust law. So they're saying that because Amazon as a platform, they sell so many different goods and services, but actually they charge a lot, right? As in they charge third-party sellers on the platform a lot. So I'm not sure if you guys are clear about what Amazon sells, but essentially when you say look up a particular product on Amazon, like an iPhone or something, Amazon doesn't just necessarily sell whatever they have in their warehouses, but then they also allow third-party sellers to list their iPhones and list their products on the site as well. So Amazon might be facilitating the sale between, say, car phone warehouse and another, say, phone seller on the website. So once you looked up like an iPhone on Amazon, you can kind of select the different sellers you can buy from, even though it's the same product. And as a result, in order to kind of benefit from the trade that Amazon provides with these other sellers on its website, Amazon would essentially charge a percentage fee for how much these other sellers make on the Amazon site. So for example, if Carphone Warehouse or like say Vodafone doesn't usually sell the phones itself, but so yeah, for example, Apple or whatever, or another retailer actually sells an iPhone for £1,000 on the Amazon website, then they might perhaps pay a 20% fee of the revenue that they make to Amazon, because Amazon essentially would be the online retailer of that product, and they would kind of like take a particular amount of money from them. So that's kind of like how Amazon operates, and you can see how that gives Amazon essentially a large amount of power in that case, because they would be able to kind of change how much they charge of these small businesses, and as a result it would affect the market prices for thousands or tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of goods and services on the market, which is why they're describing it as like a private tax from Amazon. So now let's just go into the economic diagrams of a monopoly. So normally you can see we've got this AR and the MR curve. So AR stands for average revenue and MR stands for margin revenue. So why do you think average revenue would be equal to the industry demand in this case under a monopoly? Any ideas? So again, I'll give you like 5 seconds to have a quick think about it. Okay, cool. So the reason for that is because for a monopoly, the demand for the goods in that market will be the same as the demand for the firm, since the company is the only seller in the market. So the company actually represents the entire industry. So that's why actually the demand for the industry in this case is the same as the demand for the firm, which is equal to the AR, or average revenue curve. And then, as you would have learned before about the different curves, if we just combine the different cost curves, like the marginal cost and the average cost with the revenue curves, then we would have the monopoly diagram. And since we know that for profit maximization, we will need to produce at the point where MC equals MR. So let me just get my pen out, and then I can kind of highlight that. So for profit maximization, profit max, we want to produce at MC equals MR, and it will be here, right? So in order to get the output and the price of the industry for a monopoly, then we would just extend a vertical line on the point where MC is equal to MR, and where the vertical line touches the AR, or the demand curve, would give us the price, right? Because the demand curve just shows us the market price for different amounts of output in the market. So in this case, this would be the price in the market, and also the price that the monopoly is charging for its goods. And similarly, if we look at the average cost curve, we'll be able to determine the cost of each good that we're selling, because again, the average cost curve is just a curve that shows us the cost for different amounts of quantity that we have. So if we just take this quantity, which is the profit maximizing quantity, and do the vertical line above it and see where it intersects with the cost, it's going to give us the cost per unit. So C. So in this case, we can see, because if the firm is selling at price P, but actually has a cost of creating that good of C, then for each unit of the good that the firm is selling, or each piece of bread, or each piece of shark fin, or whatever that you want to sell, they would make a profit of this much. Yeah. So the profit is, of course, profit per unit is the price you charge per unit subtracted by the cost of each unit that you create. The profit per unit is price you charge per each unit minus the cost per unit, right? And therefore, if we take this vertical amount and multiply by the quantity that we have, so you would kind of get this rectangular area. So it's just like the height, or the difference, times how much of the good that we're selling. So that would give us like the total profits that the monopoly is actually earning. Because if we take profit per unit and you times it by the number of units, then we would get total profit. So for example, if we earn like £5 of profit for each piece of bread sold, that's a baguette, a very short baguette, or maybe a sausage roll from Greg's. That Boris Johnson claims that he's made out of Greg's. So if you're selling £5 for each piece of sausage roll, and then you're selling 100 pieces, then your total profit is 5 times 100 is £500. So the same logic goes here. So the profit would be like the vertical height here, and then you times it by the quantity you sell, which is the area, and then you get the area of the total profits in the diagram. Okay, so next, so we've discussed that already. So now let's look at and compare what's the difference between a monopoly market and a perfectly competitive one. So as we've discussed, a monopoly market would charge the price of PM because they operate at MR equals MC, the profit maximization point, and they will produce at quantity QM. However, in a perfectly competitive market, you can assume that the AR is equals to the demand curve here, and also the marginal cost is equals to the supply curve. And of course, in a competitive market, the market will operate at where demand is equals to supply, right? So we've discussed why the demand is equals to AR in this case of a monopoly, and also and so for the supply, where it touches the demand would be at A, yeah? And as we can see, if the market is operating competitively at perfect competition, we would see that it would have a market price of PE and also a market quantity of QE. So compared to the monopoly, a perfectly competitive market would be able to charge us a lower market price and also a bigger quantity. So this is actually good for consumers because you will be able to get more of the good at a lower price, right? So as a result, we can argue that a monopoly is actually less efficient compared to perfect competition, because we'll be losing out on this amount of quantity in the market and we'll be paying a higher price. So if we want to kind of highlight the area of the inefficiency, then we can do so here in this orange triangle. So you can see this can be explained by consumer and producer surplus, which we can do in another lesson. But essentially, this orange shaded triangle would be the welfare loss or the deadweight loss or the cost to society because of the monopoly. Yeah. Okay, cool. So now that we understand what the economic diagram of a monopoly looks like, can you try to figure out which of the following diagrams for a monopoly is making supernormal profits, which of the following is making a loss, and which of the following is making normal profits? And so I'll give you like 10 seconds to decide which diagram is making a loss, which diagram is making normal profits, and which is making supernormal profits. Okay, so I think that's around 10 seconds. So, are you ready to face the truth? So, we're making abnormal profits or supernormal profits in this diagram, where the yellow shaded area indicates the total amount of profits we're making. And we know that because the price we're charging is higher than the cost of each unit that we're producing at, right? And then in this case, we're producing normal profits, or we're having normal profits because the price is equal to the cost. So we're kind of like breaking even in business, but whereas in economics, we're making normal profits. And then here, we're making a loss. Yeah, so because the cost is actually higher than the price that we're charging. Okay, and you can see that in order to like draw the different diagrams, all you have to do is kind of shift the AC curve above or below the AR. So if you want to draw a monopoly diagram with loss, just shift the AC curve really high, and then you would get a higher cost compared to the price that we're charging. Vice versa. But sometimes a monopoly might not actually just aim to maximize profits. So maybe sometimes the monopoly might aim to maximize sales. And in this case, they're actually even more competitive or even more efficient than a competitive market. Because if a monopoly tries to aim for sales maximization, which is basically sell as much as possible, without making a loss, then in that case, we would be producing at a point where the company is just making enough profits. Yeah? So which is at this point. So as you know, in order for a firm to make normal profits, their average cost must be equal to the average revenue. Because if that's the case, your profits is equal to your costs, right? So at this point, the company is sales maximizing. And because it is sales maximizing, we can see that the price they're charging compared to a profit maximizing monopoly is of course much lower, and the quantity that they're charging is also higher. And in this case as well, we can see that the competitive market equilibrium, not perfect competition, but a normal market equilibrium would be where demand is equal to supply. So it would be like at this point. So even this point is not as cheap, or even the normal market equilibrium charges a higher price and a lower quantity than the point where the firm is actually maximizing sales and maximizing output. Yeah. So therefore, we can see that if a monopoly does decide to go for sales maximization, then actually it might benefit consumers even more than a normal competitive market does, which is one of the advantages of monopolies we might want to consider. Okay, so one of the examples of what we've just discussed about sales maximization is Amazon. So they actually don't make a profit on Kindles. And this means Kindle prices are actually very, very low. And because of that, consumers would benefit, or they would be able to acquire the good at a very low price. So that increases consumer surplus, which is great for us, right? But then one issue with that is if companies do sell at like no profit, then they would be able to gain market share very quickly, because a lot of us would choose to buy the product, right? And therefore, this would actually force out other competitors in the market. So as you can see in the ebook market, there aren't a lot of other ebook readers out there with significant market share. And that's because the Kindle has actually captured most of the market share, since we all bought a Kindle at a very low cost. And as a result, most of us would then eventually read ebooks on Kindle rather than other tablets. And this is one of a very common strategy that tech companies tend to use. So they might do a lot of advertising and promotion, and they might give you a lot of free trials, and in order to maximize their user base and increase their market share within the market. And then once they might have achieved market dominance, then they can essentially change the market price to maximize profits, or they can pretty much restrict the quantity in the market as well. So that's one of the things that we might need to look out for. And another problem with monopolies is that they can sometimes engage in anti-competitive behavior. So for example, we know that Amazon owns all of these data on third-party sellers, and these other sellers that try to sell their products through Amazon would essentially be providing their business data to Amazon. So as a result, Amazon might be able to make use of that data in order to compete with those businesses. So that's for one thing. And another thing is that Amazon, since they know all their prices and they have all their information and profit margins and all of that stuff, then they might be able to price their goods particularly low, such that it forces the third-party seller on the Amazon platform to retreat, because they would be making a loss, since the price for, say, diapers in this case is so low that they are making a loss if they try to price match their products with Amazon. And of course, the monopolies are big enough to sustain that loss. So this is called predatory pricing. If the monopoly actually reduces the price of their products to a point so low that other entrants or other players in the market are actually making a loss by selling their goods and are forced to leave the market. And then of course, after the competitors leave the market, then Amazon would essentially raise the prices on the goods that they were selling on, right? So after reducing the prices on diapers and forcing diapers.com out of the market, then afterwards Amazon would just increase the prices on diapers and they'll be making profits again, and we consumers would suffer since now we would pay an even higher price in the long run. So it's important to kind of regulate and be careful about these type of anti-competitive behavior. Here are just some of the advantages and disadvantages of monopolies. So it's not all bad for monopolies. Because of their large amount of output, they would be able to experience economies of scale since they're the only firm operating in the market. So surely they would be producing lots of the same good, and they'll be able to access certain efficiencies, increase their productivity, and certain discounts on, like, say, raw materials that we've discussed, right? So as a result, this can kind of help push down the cost. However, even if monopolies does take advantage in having economies of scale, that does not mean that they would pass on the cost savings to the consumers and price their products at a lower price. They can just, keep the cost savings from the economies of scale and just keep them as profits to maximize them. Another advantage from a monopoly is that because of the large amount of profits they make, they can do research and development and innovate and create new products. However, of course, one would also question, would there be an incentive for a monopoly to invent new products if there aren't actually any other players in the market? So again, the answer would be it depends, right? Would there be an other company that's developing, say, a new product or technology that would upset the current balance of the monopoly? If so, then perhaps the monopoly would be more incentivized to do research and development. And we've mentioned about some of the disadvantages already. So if there's like a monopoly, most likely they might reduce the production and they might increase the cost. Not the cost, increase the price that they're charging in the market in order to maximize profits. So compared to like a competitive market, they would charge higher prices and they would produce less. So that's a disadvantage there. There will also be no incentive to control costs because there's no incentive for them to be efficient since there aren't no other competitors in the market. So I guess the only incentive to control costs in this case is to maximize their profits. But as long as they make like a reasonable amount, then it's more like there's no incentive to reduce costs even further in the long run, perhaps. So they tend to experience inefficiency. And finally, there might be a lack of choice when there's a monopoly, because if they don't have an incentive to innovate, then they might not actually create or generate new products. And usually, say, at least in an environment where there are like 2 or 3 competitors, it would tend to increase the likelihood that they would actually increase the amount of choice for different products to compete with each other. But whereas if there's only one company and they're like making massive profits and they control the market, then perhaps there might not be any consideration of choice. And of course, a lot of these monopoly companies, or a lot of these even big Fortune 500 companies, they own a lot of different brands. So as a result, you would think that all of these different brands are different companies, right? For eyewear, so like the glasses that you wear or the shades that you buy. So you've got Ray-Bans here, which is like everyone's favorite. But actually, all of these brands or partnerships with these brands belong to a company called Luxottica. So not a lot of people might have heard of this company, but essentially they're kind of like a monopoly within the eyewear space. So all of these brands, when you purchase these different brands of eyewear, you're actually benefiting this company. And similarly, all of these like big brands or big companies like Coca-Cola, they might own a lot of smaller brands, right? Like Fanta, and also Sprite. And similarly for Nestle, they might own a lot of different food brands like Maggi or like Nestle ice cream or like Nescafe, but also Nespresso. So I guess you can see the association in that case because they all start with Nes. But in many cases for the other companies, you don't even know that they're associated, and this kind of creates like an illusion of choice. You feel like you're buying from someone else or you're buying another brand, but actually you're still buying from the same company because the company owns all those brands. And I think this kind of again goes back to the limitation of choice point. So even though the monopoly or these giant companies might own lots of these different brands, and they would make you feel like you have a lot of choices in the market, but actually are these different brands still competitive or still competing with each other to produce new products? That would be the question, right? So if I own all the ice cream brands in the world, then is there really an incentive for me to create new types of ice cream that would actually generate benefit to consumers? Maybe not, right? So yeah, if you're interested, do look into the different brands that we actually buy on an everyday basis. So supposedly these like 10 companies will control most of the things that we buy from the independent, or that's what they claim. And now we've evaluated monopolies a bit, right? And we've mentioned about how perhaps even though they might experience cost savings, they might not actually reduce their prices in the market. And also, they might not actually do research and development since there's no incentive for them to do so if there's no competition. So this is kind of something to consider as well. And we can kind of cross-reference that with real-life examples. So in some situations, like Google and say Amazon and some of the tech companies, they are actually doing a lot of research and development into projects like AI and say virtual reality, or to solve the world's problems, right? So in that case, they are really doing some research and development, but then it's hard to say whether that research and development is to secure like a future business advantage over its competitors, or probably it wouldn't just be for like the good of mankind, right? So, and that's because they have shareholders to account for, and shareholders, of course, or owners of the company would want higher returns, or they would want higher profits from their companies. So incentives within the economy is an important thing to look into in many cases, and even incentives within business and within companies. So perhaps the government would be able to kind of regulate the companies in order to kind of strike the right balance between having monopolies and not having monopolies. And again, we'll talk about natural monopolies a bit later, actually, right now. Okay, so natural monopolies in general are when you've got things like railroads or telecommunication systems where the cost of building these railroads or the cost of building these infrastructure is so high that it's not efficient to have more than one railroad company that's producing these goods and services, because there's absolutely no point in duplicating the set of railroads so that there are two companies and that they would compete with each other. The cost is just too large. Similarly, there's no point in duplicating the entire energy network of a country. just in order to introduce competition. So these examples are what we call natural monopolies, and usually we will apply them to infrastructure related companies. And this is kind of like the diagram for natural monopoly. So we've got this diagram, but it will be mainly for IB economics rather than, say, A level. So don't worry too much if you're studying A level. But here, this diagram quite effectively shows how if there are more than one company, or maybe 3 or 4, then all of the companies would be making a loss in the long run, instead of having just one sustainable company. So what we're assuming here is, say if there's only one company, then they would maximize profits at the point where MC is equals to MR, right? So in this diagram, we can see that the long run has actually replaced the short run curves. And we've got the long run marginal cost instead of the short run marginal cost, and the long run average cost instead of the short run average cost. But they work the same way. So again, the profit maximization point would be where MC equals MR, which is here in this case. So if there is only one company in the market, they might produce a quantity of QM, and as a result, they would be making a profit of this much. But if there's, like, say, more than one company in the market, they might produce higher amounts of output. So say at QC. So there's 2 companies, or 2 railroad companies, and here is one company. And therefore, as a result, we can see that there's like a cost here, and the company is actually making a loss instead of this shaded area, since the average cost of producing a higher amount, or the average cost of having 2 companies produce the higher amount, would outweigh the price that they can charge. Or similarly, because of the duplication of the railroad and the cost of creating an extra set of railroads to serve customers, the cost would just be too high, such that it actually does not justify having 2 companies in the same market. Both companies would be making a loss, and they would be forced to exit the market. Yeah. So that's kind of like a traditional natural monopoly. So we've got like the Elizabeth line coming up that's like delayed again and again and again within the UK. But this is kind of like one of the ways which we can challenge the concept of the traditional natural monopolies. So even though there might be only one company that is constructing the railroad, we can have multiple companies that's managing it, or multiple train companies that's operating on the railroad. So in that sense, there would still be like competition. Yeah. Whereas perhaps the government themselves might be able to build the railroad to kind of get around this problem. And of course, the different train companies would be able to pay the government, or they'll be able to pay the company that constructed the railroad for the usage of the railroad. So, or another example would be like telecommunications networks. So even though we know that O2 have kind of like their own telecommunications network and their cables and stuff like that, but there can be other providers like giffgaff that's running on the same network. So in a sense, again, this would create more competition, even though they're both using the same set of infrastructure. So of course, finally, we kind of tie it back to technology. So monopolies and companies are always evolving, right? This is why some of the older economics concepts, or like some of the older regulation as well that we've set in the past, might not be able to apply particularly well to new firms. So in this case, in a lot of new technology companies are effectively platforms by themselves, And a platform won't be able to generate utility or a lot of value to users unless they have a lot of people using that platform. So for example, for Facebook, if there's only like 5 people joining Facebook, there's not much point, or there's not much value in Facebook as a service. There needs to be like millions of people on Facebook for you to connect with your friends and for you to add them and all of that stuff, right? But at the same time, if we have millions of people that are joining Facebook, then this might create a monopoly in the market because so many people are joining or using the same platform, there's only one platform that's providing the service. So there's kind of like an inherent conflict for tech companies because of the product they're offering and the very nature of it, how there needs to be a substantial number of buyers or consumers in order for the product to be valuable. So perhaps this is kind of like a new kind of natural monopoly where the focus is not actually on cost, but it's actually on say like the number of users and the market share in order to generate value as a product. So we can see here the US Council of Economic Advisors, they're saying that some technology markets are characterized by network effects. So the more people use the product, then the more positive spillovers or positive externalities, in this case, there will be for the other users that are joining the network. So as a result, they might come to be dominated by one company. So yeah, if you guys are interested, there's this UCL discussion as well about platform monopoly. So if you just look that up, then you'll be able to watch the video. So, and now let's get to the point of how we can tame a monopoly, or what a government can do in order to tame a monopoly. From fire-breathing dragon to a happy Minecraft pet. So there are a few ways to tame a monopoly, of course, one of which is to regulate and legislate a monopoly. So this means that if the monopoly engages in anti-competitive behavior, such as reducing their prices to force other competitors out of the market by selling at a loss, then these organizations would be able to fine the monopoly. So that's one of the ways that these regulations can be implemented. And as we can see here, these are some of the regulatory bodies that actually carry out some of the regulation and legislation. No, not legislation, but these are some of the bodies that kind of keep a close eye on these companies, and they would regulate them and tell them you should do this and you shouldn't, or otherwise we're going to fine you. And yep, so other types of things that these companies do is that they would try to prohibit collusion. So if like a few big companies in the market, if they try to work together to restrict trading or to force up prices, then they would put a stop to them. They would avoid the mergers and acquisitions of large companies. So for example, there was like a big supermarket merger in the UK previously. Now it's like 2-3 years ago. I think it's like Sainsbury's and Asda, I believe. So if these two supermarkets combine, then they would have a market share that's too big, and that they would be too close to a monopoly, and therefore perhaps these organizations would say no to the merger. And then of course there's like price regulation as well, and profit regulation. So the government might be able to say, you're a monopoly and you earn lots of profit, so I'm going to tax you a lot for that. And that's kind of like a one-off tax called a windfall tax, like on profits. Or the government can of course impose a price ceiling on the market and say that you're charging too much for water or for electricity, so you have to charge electricity below this certain price. or you have to charge, the most that you can increase your electricity prices is by the amount of inflation in the economy. So you can't suddenly increase energy prices by like 50 times or something so that households can't afford it. So here's kind of like what Americans actually think of these big tech companies and how we might be able to regulate or legislate them. So actually quite a large number of US citizens believe that the big tech companies have too much power from this survey, but actually they have slight disagreements as to how to curb or control that power. So we can see from this poll that only 46% of Americans trust Congress to regulate big tech companies, but actually 57% trust the laws, which is basically how the courts would interpret the laws passed by the Congress. And for 53% actually trust these federal agencies, so like the competitive agencies that we've looked at here. So this one is for America, the Federal Trade Commission, the CMA is for the UK, and the ACCC is for Aussie land, or for Australia. And of course there's only 34% who trust the president to control these big technology companies, because the president is of course very pro-free market at the moment, and he's got COVID recently, so that's why we've got a picture of him coughing. And yeah, so it's kind of important to understand the limitations of regulation and legislation for these big companies as well. And there are some other ways, of course, to tame a monopoly. We've got nationalization with quality standards or performance targets, so a lot of fancy terms. But what this is all saying is that the government can just buy the entire company outright, so that the company won't be maximizing profits. And since if the company is not maximizing profits but maximizing welfare instead, as they're working on behalf of the government, then they would not create inefficiencies in the market by increasing the price artificially and restricting output. However, of course, there are other problems, because state companies aren't necessarily perceived to be the most efficient, and that's why the government tends to set targets for state organizations, or performance targets or quality standards. Yeah. So for example, the NHS, you can regard it as kind of a monopoly in the healthcare sector for the provision of healthcare services. So even though there is a private sector, but then the NHS has a large amount of market share within the UK for the public healthcare service. So it provides most of the public healthcare. Most of the healthcare within the UK, and as a result, in order to ensure that the NHS is efficient, the government would set these particular targets for the NHS so that they have something to work towards. So for example, they would try to reduce the amount of time that it takes for the ambulance to get to your home if you catch COVID. Or they might seek to increase the number of patients that are being treated in one day and increase the efficiency. So that's what I mean by quality standards and performance targets. And of course, there's also trade liberalization as well. So what this means is just to reduce the barriers to entry into that monopoly market, so that we can lure more competitors or more players into the market. So the government can also help new companies that hope to challenge the monopoly by providing them subsidies to try to protect them, or try to reduce the regulation for market entry into the market. So for example, if the government wants to tackle big pharmaceutical companies, then they might reduce the amount of regulation that new pharmaceutical research companies would need in order to research on a new drug, for example. Or they might reduce the tough restrictions on the clinical trials. so that more companies will be able to afford to research into these new types of drugs, and then there would be like more entrants or challengers in the particular industry. So these are just some of the ways to essentially curb the power of monopolies by introducing new players. But perhaps all of these ways are not enough. Perhaps we need something more. So we see here that, again, very recently, October 1st, that Indian tech startups are trying to form an alliance of superheroes like the Justice League or the Avengers of Indian startups. They're trying to fight Google's monopoly. And actually, they would be probably trying to create their own Google Play platform, because currently there's only like 2 smartphone platforms that you can sell your apps on, right? Or you can produce your apps on, which is mainly the Play Store and the Apple App Store. So in that case, again, they are a platform monopoly, and then they would charge all of these different apps a certain percentage of their revenue or a certain percentage of their goods and services. So as a result, these startups might actually band together to challenge these app stores, or at least bargain for more fair proportion of revenues shared by the amount of money that they earn on these app stores through their apps. However, this might be very tricky for the everyday consumers, because we cannot like band together and tell say the Thames Water or like energy providers to give us a cheaper price on utilities. So one of the ways that the government has provided us with a little bit more bargaining power is through the Consumer Council. Yeah. And through the Consumer Council, we'll be able to lodge complaints, and the council will be able to investigate for us whether the company is actually operating fairly. And it would aim to protect us small consumers that are often bullied by big companies. So yeah, perhaps there are new and alternative ways to tackle market power. And that's pretty much it for monopolies.